WebDAV with Metasploit. In the previous video, we explored the process of how we can authenticate to a WebDAV server and upload a web shell in order to perform or in order to execute system commands on the target. And of course, that process was multifaceted. It involved performing a brute force in order to identify the WebDAV credentials, after which we utilize those credentials to authenticate to the WebDAV server, and utilized Cadaver to upload the web shell onto the DAV test server. Right now, we can also utilize the Metasploit framework in order to exploit WebDAV, and of course that can be done through a plethora of ways, and we'll be exploring two techniques that can be used to essentially achieve this. Now, we don't really have any other slides to go through. As I said, we're going to be utilizing a very similar lab environment to the previous video with a few small changes, and you'll actually see them in play. All right, so start up the lab environment, and I'll also get my instance started up, and we can get started with the practical demonstration. So I'll see you back in the lab environment. All right, so I'm back within the lab environment, and you will be provided with the target IP address. And of course, in your case, it's going to be different, right? Now, as I said, this lab environment is very similar to the previous video. And, we have a Windows target that's running Microsoft IIS that has WebDAV configured to run. And the WebDAV credentials are also the same. So the username is Bob, and the password is password_123321. The only difference with this particular lab environment is that the target, more specifically the WebDAV server, has been configured to execute specific types of ASP payloads or ASP files. In the previous video, we were able to execute ASP files or ASP payloads. The only difference was if we tried to utilize an ASP payload that would provide us with a Meterpreter session, that particular web server or Microsoft IIS server would not be able to essentially execute that particular file, primarily because of its functionality. Right? In this case, we are able to do that, and of course we'll go through the same process. We can start off by performing an Nmap scan on the target just to confirm that IIS is indeed running and WebDAV is configured to run. So we'll say Nmap, and we can say SV, and we can run this on port 80, right? And we can also use the script http enum. So http enum, and I'll paste in the target IP there, and we'll give this a couple of seconds to complete. All right, the Nmap scan is complete, and as you can see, we have WebDAV running, and it actually requires credentials or authentication. So if I open up the my Firefox browser here, and I paste in the target IP and try and access the WebDAV directory, you'll see that the credentials are pretty much the same as we had in the previous environment, or in the previous lab environment. So I can say Bob, password_123321, hit enter, and we're successfully been able to authenticate, right? So let's get started with how we can obtain a Meterpreter session, or really a reverse shell, on the target system with Metasploit. The first technique will involve generating the ASP payload ourselves with MSF Venom. Now, if you want to learn more about Metasploit or the Metasploit framework, you can check out my Metasploit framework course on INE. It's an extremely comprehensive course that will make you proficient at using the Metasploit framework. So again, in this case, I'll also explain as I move along. All right, so MSF Venom is a tool, Metasploit tool, that allows you to generate payloads that that will essentially provide you with reverse shell access or remote access to a target system. And in this case, we're going to obtain a Meterpreter session, which is really just an advanced reverse shell that allows us to perform additional functionality like upload files, download files from the target, etc., right? So in order to generate the ASP payload, we're going to say MSF Venom, and we can then say payload. We will then be using a Windows Meterpreter payload, and this is a staged payload. So we'll say Meterpreter reverse TCP. We then need to provide our IP address, and this is the Kali Linux IP address. So I'm just going to open up a new tab here, and I'm going to type in ifconfig, and my IP address is on the interface Ethernet 1. So there's my IP there. And that is what I'm going to set here, because this is the IP that the payload is going to connect to when it's executed, right? The L port is the port that this particular payload is going to connect to. So this has to be a port that's currently open on your system. In this case, I'll just use port 1234 for the sake of simplicity. We then need to specify the file format, which in this case is going to be ASP, and we can output that into the actual payload or the payload name. And in this case, we will call this meterpreter.asp, or we can simply just call it shell.asp. We'll give this a couple of seconds to generate. All right, so that is generated successfully. It will select the architecture as 32-bit. It is always recommended to use the 32-bit Meterpreter payload here, primarily because if you're not familiar or if you're not sure what architecture the target operating system is, 32-bit will work either way, regardless of whether the system is 32-bit or 64-bit. All right, so that is generated and it's stored within our home directory. So there it is, shell.asp. So we can now utilize Cadaver, and I'm just going to copy the IP address here. That is the target IP. So I'm going to say Cadaver, as we did previously, Cadaver, and we're going to say HTTP, specify the target IP and the folder, which in this case is WebDAV, hit enter. The username is Bob, and the password is password123321. All right, so there we are. We get the actual DAV sudo shell, and we can list out the files here. And we have the same files that we had when we explored this folder through our browser. So we can upload the shell that we created by saying put, and the directory where it's stored is under root and shell.asp, and we hit enter. All right, so that has been uploaded successfully, and of course we can confirm that by refreshing the actual directory listing of the WebDAV directory through our browser, and you can see we have shell.asp. Right, so the next step would be to click on it, and that will essentially execute it. But before we actually execute it, we need to set up a listener or a handler that will receive the reverse connection from the actual target system, and then send the stage that will then provide us with a Meterpreter session when executed. In order to do this, we will need to start up a Metasploit framework console session. And in order to do this, I'm just going to start the PostgreSQL database service, because the Metasploit framework console requires the actual Metasploit framework database to be started. So I'll say service PostgreSQL start, and I'll just say MSF console, right? So MSF console. There we go. We'll give this a couple of seconds to start up. All right, so in order to set up our handler, we can say use multi-handler. This is a Metasploit module that essentially is used to set up a listener for the malicious payload that you have created. In this case, we utilized the payload, or the payload that we used to generate our malicious ASP file was, so in order to set it, we'll say set payload, and it was Windows Meterpreter reverse TCP. And of course, this has to be the same payload that you had specified when generating the actual ASP file. So remember, when we were generating it here with MSF Venom, make sure that the payload you specify is the same one you use to generate the ASP file, right? And then of course we need to set up the lhost option as well as the lport option. So I'll just go back in there and we'll hit enter. We can then show the options here, and the options we need to specify is the lhost option. This is just going to be our IP address. So lhost, paste that in there. And then we specify the lport as 1234. Remember, they have to be the same options used when you were generating your malicious ASP payload with MSF Venom. And we can then hit run. That is going to start up the listener, or rather the reverse TCP handler, and it's now going to wait for a connection from the actual ASP payload that we generated. So whenever it's executed on the target, it will connect back to this particular reverse TCP handler. So in order to execute it, we can head over into the WebDAV directory and click on shell.asp. You can see it's being executed. And if we go back to our terminal, you can see it's going to say sending stage, and it'll tell us Meterpreter session 1 opened, and we have successfully gained access to the target system. All right, so we can confirm this by saying sysinfo and you can see that the system is a Windows 2016 or Windows Server 2016 system. It's a 64-bit system, and currently we have 2 logged on users, and we can get our current privileges by typing in get user ID, and we currently have elevated privileges as our privileges are anti-authority system. So in the case of this particular system, we do not need to elevate our privileges, but again, this is set up for demonstration. All right, so this is one of the techniques that you can utilize. You can go through the process of generating your payload manually and then uploading it using Cadaver. There is another technique that you can utilize, and again, this is this technique will essentially involve utilizing a Metasploit framework module, and this module essentially allows us to automate this entire process. So what I'll do is I'll exit, and that will kill that particular Meterpreter session, and we can confirm that that is the case by listing out our sessions. The name of the module is IIS upload, and that will essentially give us a list of payloads or modules for that matter. The one we're looking for is this one right over here, exploit Windows IIS WebDAV upload ASP. So that is pretty self-explanatory. This essentially allows us to upload a malicious or a Meterpreter ASP file that will provide us with a Meterpreter session onto the WebDAV server automatically, right? And we can copy that here. So I'll say copy, and we'll say use, and you now need to specify your payload or the payload that you want to use. In this case, the default payload is Windows Meterpreter reverse TCP. Because the target system is 64-bit, and we have been able to confirm that, you can change this to Windows x64 Meterpreter reverse TCP, but in this case I'll leave it as is, right? So if we say show options, you can see that we need to specify our IP address as lhost. You then need to specify the lport option, and of course in this case it's generating a new ASP file that it will then be uploading onto the target. And we have a few options that we need to specify. Because this is also going to upload the ASP file for you, you need to provide the HTTP password and username for the WebDAV server. So let's start off with that. So I'm going to say set HTTP username to Bob, and we're going to set the HTTP password to password underscore 123321. All right, so those options are set. So if I say show options, the next option that we need to set is the target IP, which is right over here. That's the rhosts option. So I'll copy the target IP right over here, and I'll say set rhosts to the target IP, and you can then change the rport option to 443 if the actual WebDAV server has an SSL certificate, and you can then set the SSL option to true. In this case, everything looks fine. As I said, because we're generating a new ASP payload, you can specify a new port. In this case, the default port is port 4444, which is fine. We then need to specify the path. This is the path that this module will attempt to upload the actual ASP file that it will generate. And in order to set this, we need to set it to the following. So we will say path, and that is going to be under the WebDAV directory. So WebDAV, and then we can provide it with a name. In this case, I'm just going to say Metasploit.asp. All right, we can then hit exploit, and that is going to start the reverse TCP handler. It's going to check WebDAV. It's then going to authenticate, and once it authenticates successfully, it is then going to upload the actual payload, the ASP payload, and it'll then rename it into an ASP file. It'll then execute the ASP payload, and it'll also delete the Metasploit.asp payload for you in order to avoid detection, right? So you can see it sends the stage, and then it opens Meterpreter session right over there. So sysinfo, and we pretty much get the same information. And if we type in get UID, anti-authority system. So as you can see, this particular Metasploit payload automated all that we had done previously. And again, the reason why I covered the manual techniques is because it's very important to know how to do it without the help of a Metasploit payload. And doing it manually also helps you understand what is going on in the background, right? So you can utilize the Metasploit payload in the event that you want to essentially automate this process. So if we take a look at the WebDAV directory here, so I'll head into WebDAV, and you can see that it actually deleted the ASP payload that it generated. So this module is very, very helpful in that way. Now, of course, you can also delete it using the cadaver utility, or we can delete the shell.esp file that we had uploaded manually very, very easily. So if we list out the help menu here, you can see we can search, we can look for the delete command. So I can say delete and shell.asp, and that's going to delete it. And of course, we can list out the contents now, and that has deleted it successfully. So that is always something that is recommended. Once you've gained access to the target system, delete any of the payloads or exploit files that you uploaded onto the target, because again, that is something that can easily be detected. So you want to be as clandestine as possible. All right, so that is going to conclude the practical demonstration side of this video.